Hello, this is Rudayna Abdo with Urban Nibbles, and today I'm joined by Khaled Shammout, who is a VP of Strategic Planning and Development for a regional transit agency in the US. Welcome, Khaled. Really good to have you here.
Thank you, Rudayna. Likewise.
Thank you. You are involved very much with the mobility sector, which has been very much impacted and directly impacted by the pandemic. Can you please reflect upon the measures you took to immediately respond to the crisis, physical distancing and other measures that you had to respond to right away?
Sure. So back in March, early mid-March, when the pandemic was at its peak and certain measures were enforced, and the governor gave orders for social distancing as well as closing of businesses and so on, transit still had to run. We're considered as an essential services. But at the same time, we had to take certain measures to protect both the customers and the drivers. So some of these measures were disinfecting the buses on a daily basis, providing hand sanitizers and wipes for our drivers to keep with them, just to wipe their seats, the steering wheels, the door handles, and so on, just so that they'll be safe. And also, our maintenance staff designed and built in-house some plastic barriers that were installed to separate the driver from the customers. So as customers are boarding the bus, they don't come in contact with the driver, and they don't have, whether it's breathing or sneezing or whatever. So all of that is protected, and and the maintenance staff did a really good job in doing that, designing it and building it as well. Some agencies had to lay off staff and so on. In other cases, we didn't have to lay off any or furlough any of our staff. So that was really good. Kept everybody busy, working, providing the services that were needed during these difficult times. Social distancing on board the buses was also mandated. And ridership was low anyway, so that was not a major issue. I think those were the main things that we did. And we also obviously changed the schedule to a Saturday schedule. So we were not running our typical weekday service. Instead, we were running the Saturday service throughout the whole week.
And any changes at the stations? Now it's warmer weather, shoulder season, probably. Are you open stations or are they enclosed transit stops? Is there a concern there with the waiting, with passengers waiting to board? Has that been a concern, pre-boarding?
Yeah, no, that has not been a concern. All our stations are open.
Okay.
And again, just because of the ridership is down, there hasn't been too many people waiting at a particular bus stop.
And moving forward now, as lockdown measures are starting to loosen, transitions are starting to go back, although it still is before the return to office work. I think we're still at the stage where we're seeing a lot of remote work, so we haven't resumed the peak operations or the higher intensity. Do you have the plan going forward as to how incrementally things will increase and how both the pre-boarding and then operation, getting to the network and then getting onto the buses, how these things will change?
Yeah, we're kind of really taking it, literally one day at a time. We're on a daily basis, we're checking the ridership, we're looking at the trends, keeping up with the political decisions in terms of opening up and businesses opening, going back to normal and so on. We haven't, and it's really difficult to kind of predict what's going to happen in a month or two from now, just because it's so volatile. But we're taking it one day at a time. We do we will be definitely changing the schedule service back to normal. We don't know when yet. As I said, we're just monitoring the trend on a daily basis. So maybe in a few weeks we'll make a decision that by end of June or early July or whenever that is, we'll go back to full service, just depending on the situation, how things are improving overall. Regardless, we would still anticipate that social distancing will be still enforced, whether it's because of the law or just because of fear. People will still feel uncomfortable sitting right next to a stranger on board the bus, and we understand that, and we're anticipating that. So most probably on certain routes, certain trips during the day, we may have to beef up the number of buses just to make up for the social distancing. We know certain trips are usually packed with high loads, so we need to provide a second bus to reduce that load. That's kind of preparation that we're working on, is to identify these kind of trips where we need to add additional buses. Definitely that would put some strain on our maintenance staff, because like any other transit agency, you have to maintain a certain spare ratio of your buses for preventive maintenance that you do on a daily basis, and so on. So having more buses than usual on the road when we go to full service will definitely, strain the maintenance staff coping with preventive maintenance or other repairs, and making sure that we have all the buses we need on the street. So that's going to impact the spare ratio. It's going to reduce that number. In terms of cost, it will add cost, definitely, because now you're having additional drivers, more fuel being consumed as well. So there will be some additional cost to us. But that's going to be part of that formula. We will still, continue to do the disinfecting of the buses on a daily basis, and providing, other, like wipes and so on for our drivers, just again to feel safe and to provide that safe environment for both drivers and customers.
I guess it's going to be a tough storm to weather, given that you have to increase your costs, increase your operations, and the cleaning part, while your revenue stream is down. So hopefully, I guess at this point you can't tell when this equation will balance. But do you feel that with potentially the flattening of the curve on the peaks, given that we maybe we'll see more and more people continuing to work remotely, and maybe this will be less of a strain on the peak. Do you see that potentially, that there could be more regulated or fewer peaks and more standardized, the service is going to be more uniform across a longer time segment? Do you foresee any changes in those trends that we used to have before?
Interesting question. And most definitely, yes, at least over the next year, until people feel more safe and almost all businesses go back to normal. So yes, you're right. We expect that. And this is part of the things that we're considering in terms of going back to full service and how we're going to phase it, in and so on. But beyond the first year, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. But we anticipate things are not going to go back to 100% normal or 100% what it used to be before the pandemic. So many people lost their jobs, so those are not going to come back immediately. Other businesses, it seems that they're getting more comfortable with working from home. So some of their employees may not go back to the offices and stay, work at home, or the businesses may encourage that as well. We don't have a lot to go on for, with these yet, but we're monitoring it. We're looking at, what other cities are doing and finding and so on. And that will be part of our plan moving forward. Yeah.
Okay, so you are sharing best practices with what other jurisdictions, whether locally within the US or internationally, are doing?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. And what do you think will happen to the mode splits? How it's going to, are we going to start seeing more congested roads because of the shift to car mobility away from transit, which would be, I guess, natural but sad to see for transit ridership?
The speeds, is that what the question is?
No, the shifting to back more to private car use, rather shifting away from transit use.
Yeah. We've been discussing this here internally as well. And again, it's all guesswork.
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, it's true when, people don't use transit, it's usually hard to come back to transit. Like, when you have a strike for a few weeks, then you lose your ridership, and it takes them many years to come back to transit. This is not similar to these kind of circumstances because it's not really a strike. People are not going to work anyway, so they haven't been greatly impacted by not having the transit, at full service. Nevertheless, we expect some of those may not come back to transit for different reasons. At the same time, which is unfortunate situation, many people lost their jobs. I mean, we have more than 30 some million, who filed for unemployment. Those may not be, at least some of them may not be able to afford to own a car. So they will still rely on transit. So we may lose some, but we may also gain others for different unfortunate reasons. So we don't think eventually the ridership is going to be hugely and negatively impacted by the loss of ridership.
Do you think this would, I'm sorry.
The ridership may decline for other reasons, that businesses have closed, so there's no need to go to that destination and so on, but not so much because of transit wasn't available for 2 or 3 months.
Do you would you consider new incentives to increase ridership, or at this point it's still too soon to tell?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really discussed that in details, but that's something that is on our radar screen. We're looking at some measures in terms of the fares, some of the passes that we may offer, just to encourage customers to ride and so on. But we haven't really made any decisions. It's a bit too early for that yet.
And are your operations contactless as far as getting on the bus, the fare, transit fares, and what have you? Is the point of contact with the machines a concern? Have things gone online? Does technology play a role in how, whether there's physical contact with the devices and how riders board and the like?
Yeah, that hasn't been a major concern. I mean, currently passengers can pay in cash or use a ticket at the fare box, but quite a bit of our customers use their mobile apps for payment. So they just show it to the driver and move on. We're in the process of installing electronic readers, so they just scan their phone against the reader. So fare payment hasn't been an issue. It is an issue more on the paratransit side. There's more contact between the driver and the passengers. They have to help, in most cases, they have to help the passenger board the vehicle, holding their chairs, tying them up, tying the chairs down to the vehicle, handling their fares, usually it's cash or what have you. That's where the more contact is taking place.
Just also a more vulnerable population by and large, presumably.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
special interest there. Have there been any surprises that you've learned on bus operations in this unusual period of lockdown and changing the way things work and what's happened?
Any surprises? That's an interesting question. Um, no, nothing that comes to mind really. Yeah. I mean, yeah, nothing. Yeah.
They have really clean buses now with the daily sanitizing.
We've got clean buses, but they're being disinfected. That's
And do you think new standards should be introduced? Now let's look past this pandemic, past whether it's the vaccination period, and then there's the clearance of the pandemic, with how things are changing, with behavioral changes from the riders. Do you think there are standards or policies or practices that have been introduced that that should be carried forward, that would be good to outlive this crisis situation, and that we should hold on to?
yeah, I think so. I think in terms of the cleansing of the buses, that's major.
Mm-hmm.
Most transit agencies do clean their buses at once a day or at least 2 or 3 times a week, which is in most cases is enough. Used to be enough. Nowadays, with the pandemic and so on, maybe that's not enough anymore, and maybe that's a new standard that we need to adopt in terms of how often the buses should be cleaned and how they're being cleaned and so on. The barriers where maybe that's something to consider between the driver and the customers. A cheaper variation of those barriers, obviously. Also, in the U.S., transit agencies get some kind of grant money based on ridership and service provided and so on. For the pandemic, services were cut. I think those standards needs to be relaxed for 2020 and maybe 2021 in terms of ridership. It's not like last year's. So definitely as transit agencies, we don't want to lose funding because of the lack of ridership, just because of the situation. So I think those, they're looking at relaxing those anyway. Spare ratio, like I was talking about, there is a mandate that you have to have minimum, 15 to 20% of spare ratio. If we're going to maintain social distancing, and as I explained earlier, that on some trips we may have to add additional buses just to be able to accommodate social distancing, well, that's going to eat up from our spare ratios. So there has to be some, again, relaxing of that mandate. In some cases, spare ratios may go down to 5% just because of, the social distancing. So yeah, the situation did bring up some interesting things, and we just have to find a way to cope with that. And I think the governments, whether at the federal or the state level, they've been accommodating, and they kind of understand what the situation is, and they're trying to figure out what's the best solution for these standards.
And in your agency, is it single door boarding, so at the driver door only, or is it all door boarding? And do you think these operations and circulations and the actual furniture layout within the buses themselves, do these need a rethink to see how circulation and distancing can be managed better? Has this been a point of discussion at all?
Well, boarding is from the front door boarding. That's a requirement. Alighting could be from either door. We haven't experienced any major issues with that yet. Again, ridership is really low. Now, when ridership goes back to normal, it will be a different conversation, and that may impact the dwell time. If still passengers are going to, comply with social distancing to some degree. Even if it's not 6 feet apart, even if they're just standing 2 or 3 feet apart, and they're boarding the bus and paying at the fare box and so on, that may have impact on the dwell time on some trips. But we just have to keep monitoring it and see if it's causing any issues, and we'll make changes.
Well, we're going to be watching the space, an ever dynamic, evolving space. I think it will be very interesting to watch, to see what happens.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
We'll be very much looking forward to keeping up and seeing how things develop.
Great. Well, thank you, Rudayna.
Great to have you.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.